Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of May. And this month, if you watched my TBR video, you know that I was trying to focus on series books this past month. And I was able to read contributions to like 13 different series. I think I caught up on like 9. So a lot of series books were read over the past month, but I also read some standalones and things that were pretty great. So let's dive into what I was able to get read. The first book that I started out with was another book in the Edge of Collapse series by Kyla Stone. And I ended up reading, just checking here, books 4 and 5 in this series. There's a total of 7. And I know I've talked about this series on other videos. And basically this is about the aftermath of an EMP attack that happens in the United States, which basically means that all of the electrical grid is no longer functional. Cars are no longer functional, newer cars anyway. Cell phones no longer functional. And we have a bunch of different characters dealing with this in their own ways. Some of them live in a small town, and so they're trying to kind of survive in this small town. And the series also starts with a woman who has escaped, basically someone who's been holding her captive. And then she goes back home to the small town and kind of reunites with a bunch of folks that are trying to survive the EMP attack there. Each book kind of tackles a different layer of this, so I'm not going to go too much into the plot, but if that sounds interesting to you, I would definitely recommend picking up the Edge of Collapse series. Okay, then I decided to try to read, and I was successful in reading all of the Court of Thorn and Roses books. So there's a 5-book series right now. I do think there's probably going to be more books added to this series in the future, but I had read A Court of Thorn and Roses in the previous month. I'd revisited it from reading it last year. And I admit in the first book, I wasn't really getting what all the fuss was about. And I thought, well, I'm just going to keep going. You know, people love this series. Let me see. And book 2 totally redeemed the series for me. It's basically about 2 different worlds, kind of a human world and a fae world. And they start to interact. And in the first book, it's basically kind of a Beauty and the Beast retelling, where a human goes into the fae world and has a romance with someone in that world who's kind of the beast. She's the beauty. And she has to go through all of these different kind of trials and things at the end of the book, which is actually kind of interesting. And in the second book, there's kind of another character who's introduced, who's also part of the Fae world. And the relationship in book 1 kind of starts to break down a little bit, and we start to see another relationship emerging in its place. And the thing that really kind of redeemed the series for me in book 2 was there was kind of this found family element of this group of friends who have been supporting each other. And if you want to think about like the big picture of this series, it's really about people kind of overcoming trauma in all of these different kinds of ways. And often through these kind of very deep friendships and relationships that they're building together. So I read book 2. Then I read book 3, which is basically all about a war. I won't go into details about why because it would give away some spoilers. But I would say book 2 was my favorite of the series. Book 3, a close second. Then book 4 was kind of like a novella, and it takes place during solstice. So it's kind of like the equivalent of when you're watching a TV show and there's like a Christmas episode. This is kind of what that was. And it was kind of odd, honestly. But what I realized was it was bridging the first 3 books, which could be a trilogy on their own, with the book that would become book 5. Book 5, I would say what it's known for is it's quite a bit spicier than the other books in the series. Now, the other books have kind of romantic elements, but they're primarily fantasy books. I would say book 5 gets way more into the romance side with less fantasy, which is kind of unfortunate because I really enjoyed the rest of the fantasy elements of the series. So I would say books 1 and 5 were not my favorites, but books 2 and 3 made it completely worth it for me to read the series. Okay. The other thing that I picked up this month, this was a standalone and a nonfiction book, was called The Good Nurse by Charles Graeber. This is a book that has been put into I think a Netflix film, if not a series. And it's basically the story of a serial killer who was in hospitals and was killing patients and going undetected for years and years and years. Kind of creepy, really unbelievable to some extent that this was allowed to happen. I really did enjoy the book, and we'll definitely be watching the adaptation because I just thought the story was really interesting. Okay, I also caught myself up on the Bergman Brothers series with the book If Only You by Chloe Leese. And this is a series that I just really, really enjoy. I love this author. I have loved kind of meeting each of the different siblings that are in this series. And this particular book follows the character of Ziggy, who identifies as autistic, and she is starting to have a relationship with one of her brother's good friends. And she's basically trying to be seen as more mature in the eyes of her family. And he is kind of a bad boy who needs to be kind of toned down through his relationship with Ziggy. And it's a great addition to the series. I really, really enjoyed it. Highly would recommend that series. All right, then I picked up The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. This is a book that I've heard amazing things about, and I will say that I can't say I had that like amazing experience that a lot of other people are having, but it's a really perfect book to read like in the fall. It has like these really wonderful witchy elements, of course, but basically it's about a woman who is a practicing witch, but she's pretending she's not a witch because she lives in a world where magic is not supposed to be kind of public and kind of out there. And she's asked to come and train 3 sisters who also have witch powers. And in the world that she lives in, witches are not supposed to be around each other because the magic can kind of get out of control, basically. And it's an environment that is really trying to control magic. And so it's kind of risky for her to go and kind of be with these girls and sisters and train them. And there's kind of a found family element of this too, of like the people who are raising the 3 sisters and how she kind of comes into the relationships with the guardians of these 3 girls. Again, a lot here to like, very much like kind of a cozy, you know, book. But I would say for me, this was kind of like a 3 out of 5 stars. Nothing necessarily wrong with it, but it just wasn't kind of like standing out to me as something really great, which I think it has been for a lot of other people. Okay. Then I was able to knock off a bunch of series where I had like 1 book left in the series to kind of catch myself up. The first one was a book called Off the Grid. This is part of the Joe Pickett series by CJ Box. This is a book that's like in the middle of this series that I completely forgot to read for some reason. Somehow I just like skipped right over it and went to the rest of the books in this series. So I went back and read this one. Reading it out of order wasn't really that big of a deal. There was an element in it that kind of filled a plot hole, you know, in terms of what had been happening in the rest of the series. And this is basically a series about Joe Pickett, who is I always forget what his position is called. Let's see if they say it in the description. Of course they don't. I want to call him like a park ranger, but that's not exactly what he is. Like basically he is a law enforcement officer who works in the outdoors. So he kind of tickets people who are hunting out of season and he gets pulled into crimes that involve the outdoors basically. And in this particular book, it follows a side character in the series called Nate Romanowski, who is a good friend of Joe's, and Nate is kind of dealing with a series of circumstances that connect him in with like the FBI. I feel like I'm not describing this very well, but basically these 2 characters are often showing up in the series together, and Nate is often protecting Joe, Joe is often protecting Nate, and Nate is a great character. He's kind of a very like rugged, almost like a criminal. He's kind of willing to do anything. He can be very violent in the books, and this really puts him as kind of a contrast to Joe, who, while he will kind of shoot people and do various things in his law enforcement position, is typically a lot more tame than what we see with the Nate Romanowski character. So anyway, now I'm completely caught up on that series. I also picked up a couple different Jeffrey Deaver books. The first one was the final book in the series for Catherine Dance called Solitude Creek. And this is basically a book about a woman who kind of reads body language as part of being a law enforcement officer. And in this particular book, there's a criminal that's kind of like setting up circumstances where people are getting kind of fearful in crowds. And so they're like reacting in crowds and causing stampedes and things like that. And they're trying to catch this particular criminal. I really like this series. There's 4 books in it right now. Deaver has not released one recently for this series, so I'm not sure if he's going to keep writing it or not. But the other book I picked up by him is a more recent series that he's been writing called Coulter Shaw. Also the 4th book in this series. The book is called Hunting Time. And Coulter Shaw is basically someone who finds like missing people. And in this particular book, he basically is like character A runs away, character B follows character A, and then like Coulter's following both of them and trying to protect character A. Like there's kind of these people running after each other, and they end up in the woods, and kind of there's multiple people kind of following each other, trying to find each other. And one of the things that Deaver's really known for is kind of these reveals that you're not expecting. And these happen throughout all of his books, no matter what series you're reading. And this book had a lot of those really great reveals. So I really enjoyed that. Okay, I also picked up another standalone, KRUEGER's How Am I Doing? 40 Conversations to Have with Yourself. I love any resource on self-reflection. This would be a great book for journaling. It basically just asks you a series of questions for you to kind of reflect and think about. I did listen to this on audio, very quick and short, but I really enjoyed that opportunity to reflect. I also picked up the most recent book in the Cork O'Connor series by William Kent KRUEGER. This is book number 19 called Fox Creek. Now, I will say there is a long-running trope in this series, and I don't want to give away any spoilers, but I will say that there is an older character that shows up in this series, significantly older, like in his 90s into his 100s. And there are many books in which it is basically like teased that this character is going to die. This is another one of the books. I feel like this has happened like 5 times in the series because he's getting so old that you're like, at some point this guy is going to move on. And he's kind of this spiritual elder within the community of the book and the characters. So it's a big deal if this guy passes on. In this particular book, this is kind of the trope that's happening again. Ironically, kind of like the Deaver book, it's one of those things where it's like character A runs into the woods, character B follows character A, character C follows character A and B. Like it was almost a very similar plot of like people running after each other into the woods, trying to protect each other in the woods. And I found it just kind of funny because I read these books like 3 books apart. And so I could really see how they were very similar to each other in some ways. I will not tell you what happens with this older gentleman character. But just know this is part of the storyline that shows up. I would say post book like 15 in the series, we start to see this coming, and it kind of makes me laugh at this point. I feel like we're supposed to feel like these deep feelings for this particular character, but because this trope has been brought up so many times, it just is getting kind of stale for me. However, I love this series and I'm glad I was able to catch up with it. Okay, and then I picked up Susan Cain's most recent book called Bittersweet: How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole. And I picked up this book because I recently read Susan Cain's book called Quiet, and I felt like I had read it too late. I had already done a bunch of research on introversion, and I just thought, you know, there was a lot in that book that I loved, but I had already learned it kind of through other channels. And so in Bittersweet, I thought, oh, this is like her new thing. I'm going to pick it up. I did really enjoy this book. And I appreciate how she's kind of like moving in this direction of basically saying like we can embrace all of our emotions and kind of hold them all together. And in some ways, this reminded me a lot of the work that's been done recently on like emotional agility. So I feel like she kind of fits into that particular space. Glad I read this book now instead of waiting too long to get into it. Okay, then I picked up one of my Alphabet Challenge books, which was called We Could Be Heroes by Mike Chen. This is a book that I feel like has gotten really mixed reviews. Once I got through it and I kind of started looking around to see what other people thought about it, some people love this book because it kind of focuses on like a platonic relationship between the 2 main characters, who are people who are basically superheroes, and they're trying to figure out how they became superheroes and what kind of their origin story is. Other people find it to fall kind of flat because I think there's not enough focus on kind of some of those relational elements. So I felt like the reviews were kind of hit or miss. In this particular book, what I would say, I did listen to it on audio. I had it on ebook as well. I felt like it had a lot of like kind of fun superhero tropes in it. Like, of course, there's a villain and there are these different like crimes that they're trying to solve together. And I love the friendship aspect of it. But I feel like because the superhero tropes are just not really my thing, this book had a hard time being my thing too. And I think there are other people who would really love this. If you're super into like superhero movies and things like that, you'd probably really enjoy it. So definitely one to pick up and try, or at least take a look at if that's something that you might enjoy. Okay, another Alphabet Challenge book that I followed up with, Who is Ma DIXON by Alexandra Andrews. I really liked this book. It went some places in the end that I wasn't expecting. Lots of fun little like twists and turns that were happening throughout this book. Basic premise is there's a girl who's hired to be an assistant to a kind of reclusive writer, and they go on a trip together, and the reclusive writer is basically killed in this accident, and the assistant takes on her identity and is basically remaking her own life around the life of this writer. All kinds of bumps and things go on from there. I don't want to give anything away, but I really like this book. I also listened to it on audio, really enjoyed it. Okay, then a few more series books. I picked up Namesake, which is the second book in the Fable series by Adrienne Young. This is a series that I think a lot of people really love, so I just want to say that up front. However, I am going to abandon this series. I have read the first 2 books in it. There's a couple other books I think that are set in this world, and it just wasn't hitting for me. Maybe because it was kind of YA fantasy, and I don't read a lot of YA fantasy, but basically it's the story of kind of a world built around trading, around characters who are kind of like diving for treasure and trying to kind of work on these different ships, and there's these different kind of tensions between the people on the different ships, and the main character has tensions with her like original family, and I don't know, I just wasn't sucked in. I wanted to be. I know this is something everybody really likes, but I also, like, if I get a couple books into a series and it's just not really sucking me in, I kind of call it. So calling that one, I'm going to set that one aside. Then I picked up the second book in the Knock 'Em Out series called Things We Hide from the Light by Lucy Score. There's a third book in this series coming out this fall. I cannot wait. I loved the first 2 books in this series. I like the first book slightly more than I like the second book, but I still really like the second book. First book is about one half of a 2-brother sibling pair, and it's kind of the romance that he has. Second book is about the other brother in the sibling pair. And then the third book is about a third kind of brother character, not a biological brother, but like a found family brother of these 2 other brothers, and how they each have kind of these different romance elements in these books. The books are like 500 pages long. However, there's always kind of this like crime element happening in the books as well, which I just find really interesting. So it's kind of a combo of romance and crime, and that's actually a really good sweet spot for me. I love books that are doing that, and there's other series I follow that also have that element as well. So really looking forward to the third one in that series. I also picked up the second book, which is the bringing the series up to a kind of its current state with Harlan Coben's The Match. And this is part of the Wild series. And the first book in the series is called The Boy from the Woods. It's basically about a boy who's found in the woods as a child, and he doesn't know what his family of origin is. And in the second book, The Match, he goes through this process of doing a DNA match, and he finds his biological father. Now, to give pretty much anything else away is going to give spoilers for what happens in this book, but I will say that the ending of this book was very satisfying in terms of answering some questions that were kind of curiosities of things that were set up in book number 1. And sometimes books are not great. They give you cliffhangers. They push you into another book in the series. And I felt like there were some really satisfying answers in just the second book of the series. Then I picked up The Lost Husband by Catherine Center. This is one of Catherine Center's books that has been adapted into a film, although I have not seen it yet. And basically about a woman who is grieving the loss of her husband and goes to live with a wonderful grandmother on a goat farm and brings her couple of kids. And they have this very healing experience of being with this kind of quirky woman on her goat farm. Of course, there's a male love interest here as well. I love this book. Catherine Center can just do no wrong. I will read all of her backlist, and I have enjoyed every single book that I've read of hers. So that's no different. Okay, then I picked up Gillian McAllister's Wrong Place, Wrong Time. This was also an Alphabet Challenge book. I loved it. It goes back and forth through time. Basically, there's a woman, this is not giving away a spoiler, who stays up one night for her son to come home. He's 18 years old, and she sees him in the street knifing another man to death. Has no idea why, doesn't know who this other man is. And when she wakes up the next morning, it's the day before this happens. And of course, she's like reeling, she doesn't know why. And she keeps going back in time further and further, doesn't exactly know why she's going back in time, but kind of realizes it's somewhat connected to this experience she had with her son. And I love stuff about kind of like time travel, quantum theory. I mean, like there were a lot of really great elements in this book, very satisfying conclusion, and a fun little mystery that you had to just kind of like dig in and figure out what was going on. So I really, really enjoyed that one. Listen to it on audio, would highly recommend. Okay. The next book that I read is one that I feel like everyone has been talking about, and I totally gave into the hype because I was concerned. There's some spoilers apparently with this book. Now that I've read it, I know what they are, and I was afraid that somebody would spoil it for me. And so I spent an entire day reading Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. This is a book basically about a girl who goes to a school to learn how to ride dragons. Now you might hear that premise and be like, this is bizarre, I'm not interested in a dragon school. But I will say that if you're someone who likes, like Harry Potter, and you like that kind of school setting, if you like Hunger Games where you have people kind of like competing against each other in a YA setting, you might enjoy this. I will clearly state though, this is not a YA book. There's some spice to it. So I would highly not recommend it for young kids or even like adolescent kids. You check that out. Like if you have kids that might enjoy this. But I would say that this is kind of young adults kind of getting into new adult territory. And I loved it. You are just rooting for this main character. She's basically forced to go to this dragon riding school by her mother. She had been raised to be what is called a scribe, which is basically working in the library. And her mother, who's in the military, is like, nope, you have to go learn how to ride dragons. It's incredibly dangerous. People are dying left and right. There are all of these different points in the book where you have these like really fun surprises that are being unveiled. 5 stars, like easy 5 stars for me. This is the first book in the series. The second one comes out this fall. I will immediately check it out. And if you are looking anywhere related to books on social media, you have probably seen people talking about this book. The hype is real. I think it's great. It is roughly 500 pages, so it's a little bit of an investment. I listened to it on audio and I had the hard copy from my library. I think both would be equally good, but highly, highly recommend it. If you read one book that I recommend this summer, it should probably be Fourth Wing. Okay. Then I picked up another one to close out a series, which is Seasonal Fears by Shannon McGuire from the Alchemical Journeys series. This is number 2 in the series. I loved the first book, Middle Game. It sets up this wonderful world that I will admit I did not fully understand. I was listening to it on audio. I was reading it in ebook form at the same time. It's a lot of like kind of complicated things happening in the series. Book 2 is set in the same world. There's actually a couple of characters from book 1 who come into book 2, but it's primarily a new cast of characters. And I think that Shannon McGuire is a genius. I think it's very clear that this is like a brilliant writer. He has brilliant plots. He's so creative. But I will say that book 2, it's just kind of like not my style. Like it was, it's hard to even describe what it is. I mean, it's kind of like contemporary magical fiction. I wouldn't necessarily say, I mean, it's fantasy, I guess, but maybe not in the traditional sense that you might think. Hard to even describe what this is about. Basically, there are these competitions between characters that inhabit seasons, and the current seasons have basically died, and so like there's this competition of who's going to like refill their slot of being the people inhabiting the seasons. If that sounds confusing to you, it's kind of confusing to me too still. I think this book is like 400 pages or something like that. I mean, I obviously read the whole thing. I was tracking on it, but this was one of those books that I kind of looked up the plot just to be like, okay, am I really understanding what's going on here? Because it feels a little abstract in terms of like what's actually happening to these characters. If this is even remotely intriguing to you, I would kind of check it out and read the description. And I feel like I'm not going to describe it very well because it's very kind of esoteric in terms of what it's doing. But I think the author is brilliant and I would highly recommend his work. I feel like the first book though was more of a hit for me than the second book. Okay. Then I picked up the 4th book in Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series. It is called The Alloy of Law. This is a series that's kind of interesting. I would actually set this book, even though it's set in the Mistborn world, it's very different than the first 3 books in the series. They take place in totally different time periods. They have different styles. The first 3 books are basically fantasy. It's great world building, relatively easy to figure out what's going on, especially for people who are not like steeped in a lot of fantasy and you don't quite read that very much. I would highly recommend the Mistborn series for folks like that. And I would put myself into that category to some extent. The first trilogy can stand alone. And it was kind of, I don't know if it was meant to stand alone, but it can stand alone. Like it has like a full arc in terms of like what's happening with the plot. When he adds on the 4th book, he shifts it forward in time by, I think, like a couple hundred years. And so the first 3 books in the series become like the mythology of book 4. And it kind of becomes like a Western style book. Now, some people like love this. They think it's amazing. There's a couple new characters, Wax and Wayne, that people love. It was okay. I mean, like I wasn't as drawn in. It wasn't as kind of like as compelling for me as the first 3 books in the trilogy, which I really, really enjoyed and would highly recommend. So I'm not quite sure what I want to do with this series. Do I continue on and kind of see where it goes? Or do I kind of call it and say, well, you know, that took a turn that I was like, you know, like not super interested in. I'm not sure yet. So kind of on the fence about that one. But if you like fantasy style Westerns, I think it would be great. And you could try the first 3 books and then see what happens in book 4. Okay, then my next alphabet challenge book, Winter Garden by Kristen Hanna. This is basically a book about a family where the mother in the family is kind of cold toward the 2 daughters who are her children. And the father is always kind of trying to get in the middle and like help them to feel connected. And when the children are grown, when the daughters are grown, one of them is kind of off being a journalist. The other one has stayed home to kind of run the family business. And when the father passes away, he basically tells the mother and the daughters, like, you need to fix this. Like you need to have a relationship that is not the one you have now. And he kind of instructs them to listen to the stories that the mother is telling that are kind of these like fairy tale stories, but are also rooted in her past. And through the course of the book, we come to find out why the mother is the way she is. She has kind of a past that has quite a bit of trauma in it. And we start to see the family kind of coming together in a different way. I don't want to give too much away because there could be some spoilers in there, but I really like Kristen Hanna. I definitely will be diving more into her backlist. I think I've read 3 of her books at this point, and they're all quite different. And so I enjoy this one. I'll definitely check out more of her books in the future. All right, then I picked up kind of a random book that I had come across on Kindle Unlimited called The Library of Lost Things by Laura Taylor Namey. I'd never read this author before. This is a YA romance about a girl who lives in an apartment with her mother, and her mother is a hoarder. And this has caused a lot of concern for the daughter because she thinks she's going to get taken away from the mother. She's in high school. She can't bring people to her home. There's a new kind of management that's taken over the apartment building, and she's afraid they're going to get found out and they're going to get kicked out of their apartment. And in the midst of all of this, she also starts to have kind of this blossoming romance with this guy at her high school, where she works in a bookstore, and he kind of comes into the bookstore and like chats with her because he works across the street. And so he kind of comes over and chats with her on a regular basis. One of the things I actually really loved about this book was the side characters. The bookstore owner, his ex-wife who owns a wig shop and she lives next door, the best friend of the girl whose mother is a hoarder. Like there's all these like fun characters that are kind of surrounding, you know, what's happening. And the male lead, kind of the male main character in this book also is very much like recovering from a physical accident that he has had. So they're kind of like both a little bit damaged and kind of leading into each other in this relationship. If you've watched these videos, you know that's kind of a sweet spot for me with YA romance. I love when people are bringing kind of their full selves and they're kind of, you know, not perfect to these relationships and they're trying to figure out how to be together. So really enjoyed that one as well. I have no idea what other books this author has read, so I need to look into that, what other books this author has written. So I need to look into that and see if there's any others I might want to check out. Okay, then I picked up my last alphabet challenge book for the month called We Were Never Here by Andrea Bartz. And basic premise of this book, 2 adult female best friends who've known each other since college travel the world together. Periodically, they kind of leave their jobs for like a week and they go to a foreign country and they hang out together, and then they go back to their respective countries. One's set in the US, one is in Australia. One time they go to Cambodia, and this is not giving away a spoiler, I think this is included in the book description. And while they're in Cambodia, they kill a man. They kill a man together, basically because he is trying to sexually assault one of them, and the other one comes in and kind of rescues, you know, the friend, and then they have to dispose of this guy's body in Cambodia. Okay, then like a year later, they're in South America, and it happens again. And it causes all of this questioning from one of the two women of the friendship pair, who's like, why does this keep happening to us? Like, she starts to have some suspicions of her friend and kind of what's going on there. And then her friend, who's from a foreign country, kind of moves back, and they start to have kind of even more tension between them. Don't want to go much further than that because I think it'll give some stuff away. But I thought this book was really kind of a fun, like, romp where you have all these different things happening. You're kind of following along what's going on. I basically read this in a day. And I just kept like flipping the pages, wanting to know what was going to happen with this like eventual tension between these two friends and kind of how this was all going to resolve itself. Because it gets to be kind of a mess in the end. And I think those books are always kind of interesting. So I would recommend that one as well. I found the ratings for this book were on the lower side, like more like toward like 3.5 or 3 stars. And I gave it a solid 4 stars. I thought it was like interesting and fun. And so I feel like people are probably kind of split on this one in terms of what they think. But in terms of just kind of like typical thriller territory, I thought it was great. Okay, then the last book that I read in the month was one more book into the series that I'm trying to read this year, which is Case Scarpetta series by Patricia Cornwell. I was on book 3, which is called All That Remains. And I have been kind of slowly working my way through this series. There were several books in the beginning of this series that I have read before, and I'm kind of rereading them. The last time I read this book was in 2007, so it's been over 15 years. No recollection whatsoever of the plot, which is true of the first 2 books in the series as well. I just had no recollection of it. I basically listened to it on audio, like over the course of a morning. Didn't take very long. And I am really enjoying getting back into this series. It's basically about a coroner, but they do a lot of kind of like forensic science in these books. It's like early CSI. And all the technology now is like completely outdated in terms of what they're talking about. And like at that time, like DNA testing was like a new thing. And now it's like, you know, obviously not a new thing. But I really like the series. I like the main character. I'm realizing how much the main character in this series reminds me of the main character in Kathy Reich's Bones series, who also happens to be a coroner and also uses a lot of forensic science. And the voice is actually very similar. And I almost wonder, I need to check on this, if the audiobooks are narrated by the same person, because this is why I feel like the voice is kind of like the same in my head. I need to see if they're using the same narrator, because that would be kind of strange, but would make sense. And so I'm really enjoying this series. Glad that I could put one more book from that list into my kind of checked off pile. I think there's like 27 books total in this series, so I got to get reading this year to make sure that I am able to finish that out. So lots of series progress. Over the month of May, I was thrilled with how many series I was able to catch up on. I wanted to try to catch up on at least 23 series in the year of 2023. And this helped me get so much further on that journey, and reminds me of why I love so many of these series. They're so, so good. So if you haven't already, check out my video for what I'm going to be reading in the month of June. A lot of really great books coming up there too. And until next time, happy reading.